A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
It started last Tuesday when I was out for my evening run, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees lining our quiet suburban street. I spotted the first lost dog sign tacked to a telephone pole, its bright yellow paper obscured by the overgrown branches. The picture showed a scraggly creature with matted fur and eyes so wide and unsettling they seemed to be pleading for help. I dismissed it as a typical lost pet notice, maybe one that had come from the nearby park. It wasn't until I'd completed my circuit and headed home that I spotted another sign, this time near the park entrance. Strange, I thought, it had the same image on it, but the name had changed to Max. I shrugged it off. It was a big neighborhood with lots of families, and dogs go missing all the time. But then, each day after that, more signs popped up, at the grocery store, on the mailboxes, even on my front yard. Some were for Max, others for Bella, Toby, and Luna, but they all had that same eerie image of the creature that looked like a dog yet was distinctly off. Its snout was too long, its body too thin, and those wide eyes. They felt almost human. Curiosity turned to unease, especially as I noticed my neighbors becoming increasingly frantic. Mrs. Lemmy, who lived 2 doors down, was in tears as she stapled a new sign on her door. The missing dog, of course, looked unnaturally similar to the others. I visited her that evening under the pretext of offering assistance, and her trembling hands, as she'd served me iced tea, told me she had checked every neighbor's yard and even the woods at the end of the block, but to no avail. "These signs are just going to keep appearing," she murmured, her voice laced with dread. "It's like they're multiplying." It wasn't long before the reports reached the community forum, detailing how more dogs were going missing. Some claimed they had seen strange figures lurking around at night, the long shadows of the trees contorting into silhouettes that dashed away just as you turned your head. Desperate for answers, I decided to dig a little deeper. I pulled out my old camera and determined to patrol the neighborhood after dark. The first night, it was quiet, the aimless rustle of leaves and the distant bark of the neighbor's dog my only company. But around the corner, something caught my eye. There it was, a figure crouched low among the shrubs, its eyes reflecting like 2 tiny lanterns. My heart raced as I slowly raised the camera, focusing on the creature, which looked just like the image on the signs but so much more sinister in person. The flash went off, and for a moment, it seemed stunned, but before I could capture it again, it darted off, vanishing into the dark, leaving a chill down my spine. In the following days, my findings began to spread across town. But instead of alertness, laughter met my tales, as if somehow they dismissed the very real, creeping dread I felt each time I scanned the shadows of my street. "A wild dog, probably," they sneered, rolling their eyes, but I knew in my gut it was something much worse. The signs kept multiplying, a chorus of mournful faces watching the streets, and one chilly evening, I decided I'd had enough. I enlisted the help of a few more determined neighbors, and together with flashlights and a few brave hearts, we prowled through the woods, our voices breaking the silence, calling out for the lost dogs while treading carefully on the crackling leaves. But what we found only deepened the mystery: a small clearing, littered with torn scraps of posters and impossibly old bones, and there it was, a large, twisted tree in the center that seemed to bear the weight of 1,000 lost souls, its branches stretching out like gnarled fingers waiting to grab at anything that dared approach. Suddenly, one of the neighbors, Kevin, shouted as he took a step back, skin pale as he pointed toward the tree. I squinted into the dark, and as I did, something shifted in the branches. An unnatural sound, almost like a wet giggle, rolled through the clearing, and there it was again, the creature, larger now, its eyes glowing, partially obscured by shadows but undeniably present. You could even see the flicker of movement in those ghastly limbs as if it was gathering the energy of every lost dog, feeding off their despair. Panic surged through me, and against my better judgment, I ran. The others followed suit, fear drumming in our hearts as we crashed through the underbrush, praying the creature wouldn't pursue us. We emerged from the woods gasping, feeling like we'd escaped a nightmare, but the frantic barks of our own pets filled the air. It was like the whole neighborhood had awakened from a slumber. And then the signs took a darker turn. Posters of people started to appear, all missing, with the same sinister creature lurking in the background of each picture, different names but eerily similar faces. It dawned on me that it wasn't just dogs, this thing was gathering something else entirely. Days passed in a fever of anxiety, and sleep became a luxury, The fear bore down on me like a weight, a constant reminder that the creature could be watching, waiting for the shadows to stretch just long enough to grasp any who lingered too long outside. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, doors were locked early, and the streetlights seemed to dim to a sickly orange. My heart raced for every new day when I feared what I might find next, a sign with my own name, perhaps? Until one fateful night when a scream shattered the quiet. It came from Mrs. Lemmy's house. I ran, feeling adrenaline surge. I found her standing in her doorway, holding her old golden retriever, Jack, who was trembling uncontrollably, staring at something beyond my vision. I turned, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, and there it was again. The creature, now undeniable, hovered at the edge of the yard, tilting its head as if studying us. Its eyes were endless. Voids, glistening with a hunger that twisted my stomach. I don't remember how quickly I ran from that place, but I do remember the last thing I saw, the creature's long limbs unfurling like shadow vines stretching toward our retreating forms. Neighbors began to vanish, one by one, as fear gripped our community, the signs now an ominous reminder of those we were losing. By the end of the week, it felt like we were all living in a horror movie where the credits were imminent. Then, as I came home from the grocery store, I noticed a new sign in my yard, a crude drawing of my own face with a happy smile and the word "found" scrawled across it in bold letters. I felt the blood drain from my face. It was a warning, a sign that the hunt was nearing its prey. I bolted inside, barricading myself in, breathing heavily as reality began to close in like the darkness outside. My phone buzzed at my side, and I glanced down. My heart dropped as I read a message from an unknown number. It simply said, "You're next." My breath went shallow. Desperate to understand what this thing wanted, I scoured the internet for answers and stumbled upon local legends of a creature that once roamed the area, a guardian of lost souls that demanded companionship, an appetite satiated only by the grief of the lonely. It dawned on me that every sign was a signal, each pleading for attention feeding its insatiable hunger. I looked out the window and saw it standing in the street, just watching, its eyes reflecting the streetlight like two malevolent suns. And that's when I realized, each lost dog, each vanishing neighbor, and every creeping sign revealing its grotesque likeness meant something far more sinister. I needed to keep running or join the signs myself, reminding anyone who dared stop the moment they laid their eyes on the creature. And in a neighborhood where every corner is now a haunting reminder of those who vanished, I silently prayed to see another dawn before my own name joined the next lost dog sign in this nightmare turned reality. An unsettling truth crept into my life after my grandfather passed. While grappling with grief, I suddenly realized that nothing I ate tasted right. It began with the coffee I needed to get through mornings, the rich aroma I'd always loved morphing into a flavorless sludge that left me gagging. Things only worsened from there. Cereal became cardboard, my beloved spaghetti tasted like wet tissue, and even the comfort of chocolate felt like chewing on crumbs of dust. My friends laughed it off, insisting that it was simply my melancholic state bleeding into my palate, yet I knew something was wrong. A gnawing dread coiled in my gut. Could this be a form of depression? But no, it was deeper, a heavy fog of something sinister wrapping around me, drenching everything in a dull monotone. I began avoiding meals altogether, choosing instead to endlessly scroll past mouth-watering recipes and drool-worthy food photos on my phone, watching as the vibrant colors blurred into the background of my existence. One night, in an effort to break the cycle, I visited an old diner on the outskirts of town after hearing whispers about their legendary pancakes. The diner glowed warmly under the night sky, and I felt hope as I walked through the door, but as I bit into the fluffy golden stack, the taste was nothing. It was a void, an absence that pinched my spirit. Defeated, I fled into the darkened streets and found myself drawn to a nearby grocery store lit like a beacon through the haze of my despair. I wandered the aisles aimlessly, staring blankly at rows of perfectly packaged foods, each label a mockery of flavors I could no longer experience. That's when I met her, a woman with raven black hair and piercing eyes who seemed to draw the air away from the room. "You look lost," she said, her voice a soft melody against the silence around us. I half laughed, half sobbed as I confessed my plight, hoping she would understand. She leaned closer, a flicker of excitement igniting in her gaze. "I can help you," she whispered, "but you have to trust me." It felt absurd yet magnetic, the idea that a stranger could offer me a way back to tasting life. She led me down a narrow aisle lined with dusty jars and forgotten ingredients, her fingers brushing past grotesque labels that warned of forbidden flavors. "This is the answer to your problem," she said, holding up a jar filled with what appeared to be blackened, swirling liquid. Embrace the dark. It will open your senses. My instincts screamed at me to run, but desperation pulled me closer. I took the jar, heart racing with a mix of fear and hope, and brought it home, unsure of what it contained. That night, with trembling hands, I cracked it open and a rancid scent wrapped around me like a shroud. Against the warning bells ringing in my mind, I dipped a spoon into the thick liquid and brought it to my lips. The flavor that erupted in my mouth was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was raw and chaotic, fragility. Twisting into ecstasy, for the first time, food had a punch. Wine didn't taste like grapes anymore, it dripped like honey, sharp and rich, while the bread felt alive, pulsating with warmth. With that first taste, my body surged with a high I hadn't expected, vivid sensations flooding my senses, memories exploding in flashes. But then, a gnawing fear clawed at me, the realization that I had invited something sinister into my life. I had opened a door I could never truly close, and each meal thereafter was a concoction I had to tweak, increasing the dose to chase that first euphoria. Days turned to weeks, and soon those tasty moments twisted dark, becoming an unquenchable thirst, an addiction that eclipsed my life. I turned insatiable, devouring strangers' meals at restaurants, stealing bites of their food without remorse, all to avoid that dreadful taste of emptiness returning. The woman visited me sometimes in dreams, her shadow eclipsing my thoughts, urging me to indulge deeper, to lose myself completely. More, she whispered, a siren's call echoing our past, entangling my desires and echoing in the recesses of my mind. Each time I indulged, the hue of sweetness became darker, the emptiness creeping back like a tide at my ankles until I found myself at the brink of drowning. I woke one night to a strange groaning sound under my bed. The darkness had manifested into a massive, twisted entity, its limbs laden with sorrow and hunger. It whispered to me, promising more if only I'd continue feeding it the wrong flavors. Panic seized me. I was feeding some unfathomable beast that would never be satisfied, and I realized too late that nothing I had consumed had truly belonged to me. The black liquid rendered me a stranger within my own skin, transforming my cravings into a void. I ran to the grocery store, but the woman's presence felt distant, a ghastly memory haunting each aisle. I screamed for understanding, for salvation, until the old diner loomed ahead like a faded photograph of better times. There, I stood with my heart gripped in a shadow's hand, begging for help, but all that stared back at me were the cold plates and empty chairs. I opened that cursed jar one last time and realized, too late, that nothing I ate would ever taste right again, each bite crawling with shadows, laughter piercing in the dark, echoing a truth that twisted in the recesses of my mind. No matter how hard I tried to escape the prison of flavorless memories, I was devouring nothing but the ghosts of my own despair. I'm the sole survivor of a roller coaster that couldn't be stopped for 12 hours, and if you think that's just a wild thrill ride, let me tell you it was the longest nightmare of my life. It began as an ordinary summer day at Crystal Lake Amusement Park, the kind of place where laughter mingled with the scent of popcorn and cotton candy, but I had no idea that one moment of reckless fun would come to define my existence. After a few rounds of the Ferris wheel and a disastrous attempt at the bumper cars that left me with a bruised ego, I found myself staring up at the park's crown jewel, the Cyclone Fury, a monstrous coaster renowned for its dizzying loops and spine-tingling drops. Unlike my friends who had grown tired of the lines, I was determined to conquer the beast, and as I climbed aboard the old wooden car, I felt the surge of exhilaration mingling with the slightest twinge of dread. The ride began with a heavy rumble. The slow ascent was almost soothing against the backdrop of screams and laughter, until we crested the top and the world fell away beneath us. I remember the moment as if it were frozen in time, the realization dawning on me that this was no ordinary ride as we plummeted downwards, screaming in delight and terror, but something felt off. The safety bar pressed painfully against my lap and an unusual jolt ricocheted through the train, causing a disconcerting slant. Something rattled, something snapped, and then we were stuck. Suspended in midair, the cacophony of screams morphing into panic as frantic shouts filled the air, realizing too late that malfunction was not in the script for a day of fun. My heart thundered in my chest, the strap digging into my skin like a vice. I could already hear the distant wails of weekend warriors, families divided by fear, and the park staff scrambling, but their efforts only seemed to amplify our despair as the coaster remained painfully still, dangling, high above the ground. Time lost meaning as the sun arched across the sky. I could feel my limbs growing numb from the strain, the blood rushing to my head, and I gripped the metal bar until my knuckles turned white, while beneath us children yelled for their parents, couples clung to each other in terror, and the unthinkable heaviness of dread pooled in my stomach. It wasn't just a ride anymore, it felt like a cruel game, a twisted trial orchestrated by some unseen force, a laugh echoing in the empty corners of my mind. But eventually, our screams drew attention, and rescue teams arrived, yet they offered no comfort. The safety mechanisms failed, leaving us at the mercy of a failing roller coaster, and any hope of escape disappeared when the park announced over the PA that they were working on a solution, the words like sharp blades slicing through our anxiety. Hours dragged on, the sun dipping below the horizon, and darkness enveloped us, shadows creeping in like sinister giants as the night air turned chill, suffocating me with a sense of impending doom, and the fear became animistic, primal. I could hear my fellow riders whispering about how this would end. The haunting thought that we might never be released became an unwelcome companion. I watched as some of those around me succumbed to despair. I saw a mother trying to keep her child calm as fear twisted his small face into a mask of terror. I can still hear her soothing words, now tinged with desperation as the minutes stretched impossibly into hours. It was around hour 6, maybe 7, when the first one lost it. A man, mid-30s, began to scream, the sound hollow and desperate, clawing at the restraints, his face twisted into a grotesque expression of panic and fury as he fought against the seat. He took a leap of faith that none of us would dare, wrenching himself free when the ride lurched, flinging himself into the void. We didn't see what happened next. The screams morphed into silence, and soon he was just another ghost in our collective memory. The darkness grew heavier as I watched a few riders begin to lose their minds, rage and regret spilling out into manic laughter, hallucinations flickering at the edges of our confinement. I heard murmurings of things that couldn't possibly be real. The ground was moving, monsters skittering in the dark, and shadows and voices taunted us with promises of freedom that never came. I tried to keep my mind grounded, focusing on the people around me, but despair hung in the air like a noxious gas, and when I saw the blood on the harness of the boy next to me, I realized we were losing the battle to stay sane, the amusement park now an iron prison. I struggled against the waves of memory that threatened to bury me, thoughts of loved ones and what they would say echoing against the walls of my mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, voices broke through the darkness, and I thought I was dreaming when I saw lights, real lights, shining brightly. The ride jerked violently again, and before I knew it, we plummeted once more into the depths of despair. But somehow, we landed back at the platform, shocked and dazed. A parade of medics rushed forward, whisking me away from the other riders, and as they forced me to sit and recline, I glanced back at the track. No one else emerged. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I was the sole survivor, but I wish I could say they set me free. I was left in endless therapy, haunted by what I had witnessed, the screams echoing in my mind. Nights turned into days, the shadows morphing in my dreams, but I could never escape the truth that we were never meant to be saved, that something wanted to see how far we would break before the last piece fell away. Days turned into weeks, but every time someone asked me about the incident, I found myself leaning back, seeking refuge in that memory of weightlessness, that last exhilarating plunge that still brings cold sweat to my brow even now. Even as I sit here recounting this horror, I cannot shake the feeling that it's not over. Just a few nights ago, I woke from a dream where a child, a small boy with wide eyes, reached out of the darkness, crying for me. It was then that I finally understood. I may be the sole survivor, but there are stories that cannot be buried, stories that refuse to die, and they're waiting for me to tell them. So if you ever stand under sinister rides at any amusement park, just know, sometimes, when the lights go dark, it's not just a malfunction, something is watching, waiting, and it's never really done with you. It started with a casual conversation on a Tuesday evening, lighthearted, filled with the laughter of college kids winding down from a long day, but when my girlfriend, Claire, told me I wasn't her type, something inside me cracked. She never elaborated, just shrugged as if it were an afterthought, leaving me to face the lurking shadows of self-doubt that crept in with the fading sunlight. At first, I tried to shake it off, punishing myself for the weakness of my ego. After all, Claire was perfect on every level, smart, beautiful, effortlessly social, and I was just a hapless guy whose biggest achievement was sinking hours into video games. Yet, the words echoed like a haunting refrain, reverberating through my skull, gnawing at my heart until I couldn't sleep, picturing her with all those other guys who fit into the mold she had neatly crafted, Guys who wore the trendy clothes, had the perfect haircuts, and could actually say they enjoyed working out instead of marathoning sci-fi series. Days turned into a blur of me analyzing every interaction, every smile she threw my way. Was it pity? Was it boredom? What was so wrong with me that I couldn't be her type? The anxiety morphed into obsession. I found myself following her on social media, scrutinizing her interactions with this muscular guy from her chemistry class whose posts were flooded with gym selfies. Sometimes I'd see her liking his pictures and my stomach would twist into a tight knot, and I convinced myself this was the beginning of the end. I'd lie awake at night, heart racing, imagining her slipping away, noticing how the way she looked at me shifted ever so slightly, like she was watching me drown without a hint of a life preserver in sight, and gradually, I lost my sense of worth, morphing into this shell of a person who was terrified of offending her or revealing my weaknesses. One night, after noticing she had posted another selfie with the dude from class, I confronted her, my voice quivering, raw with desperation, and her expression twisted into annoyance. "It's just a picture, you know that, right?" She snapped, and when I pressed her for more clarity on her type, she rolled her eyes. "Can't you just focus on being you?" But in that moment, I felt like me just wasn't enough anymore. Days turned into weeks, and I began to seep into a dark hole of anxiety and insomnia. Odd thoughts forming with morbid clarity. I couldn't shake the idea that if I couldn't truly be who she wanted, I'd have to embody the type she described. I'm no stranger to the online world, so with frantic energy, I dove deep into the rabbit hole, devouring fitness and fashion videos, piecing together the public persona I could create, an inescapable facade of masculinity that would weave me into her world seamlessly. I joined a gym, thoughtlessly disregarding the sweltering sweat and exhaustion coursing through me. And every time I stepped into that fluorescent-lit hellhole, I felt monstrous and alive, pushing myself for every ounce of strength, running on raw determination mixed with sheer terror. As my body transformed, it felt like someone paid attention to the figure looking back in the mirror, but every praise I wallowed in at the gym still couldn't quell the gnawing inside, that clawing fear that I could never truly become what Claire needed, and it consumed me further until I became obsessed with the will to possess what I thought I lacked. But I was losing my own identity in the process. Friends began to comment on how different I was, while visions of my former self slipped through my fingers like sand, yet I cradled Claire's praise like a warm blanket and willed myself to believe she would finally see me as her type. The nights I would lay awake finally turned in, awakening next to an almost stranger in my own bed, this muscular facade who thought he could win her heart through sheer visuals. The screaming implications disguised as compliments for my newly chiseled body echoed hollow in my mind. Then one fateful night, after a long week of training, an invitation came for an end-of-semester party thrown by her friends, and for a fleeting moment, I felt sure this would finally confirm everything. I would revel in the new attention and win Claire's heart back wholly. But as the party buzzed with life, I felt a chill creeping up my spine every time I glimpsed Claire across the room, laughing effortlessly as she leaned over to talk to that hulk of a guy, his arm slung casually over her shoulder as if she belonged to him. I fought the suffocating wave of envy rising in my throat as I approached, but the sudden laughter died in my chest when I overheard her say, "You know, sometimes I think we'd be like the perfect couple." Then it crashed down upon me like a tidal wave of realization. No matter how I reinvented myself physically, the intangible connection we shared, the sparks of spontaneous laughter, our late-night talks, was now a frayed thread, slipping away. I staggered backward, aware that it wasn't merely about a rejection. She hadn't just called me out, she had unknowingly stripped away my identity piece by piece. I turned to leave, heart pounding in my ears, when I caught myself in a mirror. No, not just the mirror, but the reflection of the scariest thing I'd ever seen. I was tangibly being consumed by desire, morphing into something I wasn't, desperately wanting to be the guy who fit the mold she had shackled me into, so caught up in her image of perfection that I could barely remember who I had been just weeks ago. And the worst part? As I fled the party, a larger part of me knew Claire deserved someone who was genuinely themselves, not a puppet dancing to her whims. Yet, as I stood outside, the icy night air biting through my shirt, I realized I may have lost her forever, and that left me empty, slowly unraveling at the seams as the laughter behind me faded like smoke in the wind, clutching desperately to the shards of who I once was while a haunting whisper echoed in my mind, what if I'd never truly existed at all? I've always known my husband, Mark, to be an eccentric artist, a genius trapped in the mundane, with canvases splattered and chaotic like his thoughts, but lately, there's been something chilling about his work, It started a month ago when he brought home a new set of oil paints in shades that seemed far too vivid, almost alive, hues that gleamed under the fluorescent kitchen lights, and urged him to show me what he was working on, but he just waved his hands dismissively, saying he was in the zone, so I left him alone as he locked himself away in his studio for hours on end. During those stretches of silence, I'd often hear soft whispers seeping from under the door, like the taunting echoes of some ghastly conversation that kept my internal alarm bell ringing. I tried to brush it off as mere imagination until one night, curiosity gnawed at me, and I took a peek. I swear I saw him standing there, brush in hand, his eyes wide and frenzied, staring at the painting he was creating, a portrait of a woman whose face was disturbingly vivid, right down to the soul-deep sadness reflected in her eyes. They seemed to glisten with regret, and something about the painting made my skin crawl, and I couldn't shake the feeling it was more than just oil or canvas. In fact, it felt like it was alive. It's as if the very brushstrokes pulsated with some entity, and why couldn't I shake the feeling that the woman in the painting was watching me too? I stumbled back, my throat dry, fought off a wave of nausea, and headed back to bed, praying sleep would ease these disturbing thoughts, but rest didn't come, not while Mark continued to paint in the darkness, creating a symphony of gasps and strange movements echoing in the night. I could hardly focus on anything for days. Even when Mark emerged from his self-imposed darkness, he seemed different, paler, withdrawn, speaking in broken sentences as if he had trouble forming thoughts, and the paintings continued to multiply in the studio, each one more haunting than the last, showcasing fragmented scenes of despair and shadows in corners. I started asking him about them, trying to understand if it was just an artistic phase. He only stared blankly, his once inquisitive nature replaced with this eerie calmness, claiming it was just a way to express himself, but I couldn't escape the feeling that these pieces were more like glimpses into a nightmare. With each passing day, I saw changes in him, moments of laughter replaced with aggression. He would throw things across the room if a throw pillow fell out of place, and it horrified me that something so simple could set him off. The realization hit me like ice water. I was losing him to whatever madness was lurking in those canvases. After a particularly volatile episode where he screamed at me for stepping into the studio without permission, I decided to confront him, but found myself unexpectedly paralyzed, standing frozen at the doorway as he furiously painted a scene that roared with pain, depicting a figure shackled and screaming, and in an instinctive dart of panic, I flipped on the lights, plunging the room into harsh illumination only to reveal that there were no paintbrushes, just streaks of fresh blood running down the side of the canvas, transforming its agonizing images into something grotesque and terrifying. Mark turned to me, and his eyes. They weren't my husband's anymore, they burned with a merciless hunger, reflecting the raw essence of a man possessed. I fled, my pulse hammering in my ears, and I spent nights listing scents in the air that were choking me. Concerned friends asked after him. When I answered, I felt like a traitor because every word reduced him to a monster. Then it all took a turn for the eerie when I began receiving odd notes slipped under our door. They were messages sketched in charcoal and full of unsettling poetry about desire, despair, and loss, always signed with one ominous initial, A. I realized they were responses to what Mark was creating. Each note chillingly reflected his latest painting, like someone was watching us from an invisible mirror. My paranoia at its peak, I decided I had to put an end to it. I locked myself in the studio one night, determined to confront the source of his madness, but as I moved closer to the paintings, the whispers enveloped me more intensely, transforming into a cacophony of cries and laughter. I could hardly breathe, but I found myself drawn to the latest piece, which almost looked like a portal. The colors swirled hypnotically as I touched it, an icy jolt slipped through my veins, images rushing at me, visions of torment and despair, and screams for help reverberated around me until I was nothing but a doll trapped in a whirlwind of pain. It was like I was trapped inside his mind, feeling his hunger for fame and the consuming need to create. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed whole, and as reality shattered around me, I realized I was becoming just another subject. I jolted upright in bed, gasping, only to find the house cold, heart racing, and Mark was sitting in the corner, staring at me blankly, his own visage haunting to behold. I rushed for my phone to call for help, but as the light flickered on, I noticed my own face staring back at me from the walls of our bedroom. My own expression of anguish stretched across the canvases he created. My pleas were now woven into his artwork, trapping my essence, forever in torment as I realized with horror that I had become the subject of his masterpiece. The next gallery showing awaited us and he would unveil me among his greatest works. Pulling the curtain back, and there in the spotlight, he smiled, But it wasn't Mark anymore. The real Mark was lost somewhere within the depth of those haunting strokes, and as the darkness swelled within him, only the connection to that woman in his paintings remained as the final brushstroke was laid down, sealing my fate and trapping me in a nightmarish gallery, forever watching as he shared his twisted realities with the world. I never thought I'd end up back in that cursed town, the echo of my childhood drifting through the trees like a ghost that refused to let me go. Even now, in the soft light of a fading autumn sun, I could almost hear the laughter of my friends, but the laughter was gone, replaced by the hollow memories of those who had vanished, swallowed by the woods that surrounded the town like a greedy maw. I had sworn never to return after the things we found, or rather, the things that found us, always a game of hide and seek, until one day, the game turned sinister, and Jason never came back, leaving us with nothing but guilt and a sense of betrayal that festered like a wound. So when my mother called, tears breaking her voice as she told me about her cancer diagnosis, I had little choice but to return and support her. After all, I had abandoned her once, and this time, I prayed my presence would bring some comfort as I sifted through my childhood home, a house smelling of phantoms and memories, where the air felt thick with dread. The moment I stepped inside, chills raced along my spine, furniture covered in white sheets loomed like specters, shadows stretched and twisted in unnatural ways, and memories flooded my mind like water through a crack in the dam. Yet as the night wore on, it wasn't the memories of Jason that haunted me but an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong, very wrong. It started as a whisper, a voice barely audible, sneaking through the cracks like cold air beneath a door. "Come play." At first, I dismissed it, tired from the arduous day of packing and cleaning the remnants of my childhood life, but as the night deepened, the voice grew stronger and more insistent, a tone familiar and yet twisted, and I found myself wandering back into the woods, lured by a pull so primal I couldn't resist. The trees were ancient and gnarled, their branches reached out like skeletal fingers, begging me to turn back, yet I pressed on, driven by that seductive whisper that twisted my thoughts. I soon stumbled upon a clearing, the very same spot where our games had turned deadly, where we had last seen Jason, his laughter echoing tauntingly in my memory. The moon hung low, illuminating the ground littered with faded remnants of our childhood, half-buried toys, crumpled candy wrappers, yet what chilled me further were the symbols drawn into the earth, crude markings that felt like a testament to a younger version of me that had dared to summon something darker, something that had answered. My breath quickened as the whispers escalated into a cacophony, the winds shifting, carrying with it twisted snippets of laughter blending with pained cries that echoed from the depths of the trees beyond, a dissonance of joy and despair. I staggered back as I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows, my heart racing like a caged bird, and there it was, like a mirage from my nightmares. Jason stood at the edge of the darkness, his eyes hollow, skin stretched over bone, and a smile so grotesque that it felt like a lie crafted to lure me closer. "You came back," he said, the voice unmistakably his yet completely wrong, dripping with an unsettling glee that sent shivers down my spine, and within seconds my legs were moving on their own. Propelled by a mix of longing and horror, I had thought he was a memory, a ghost, but there he was, alive, and somehow incredibly alive. He beckoned me, revealing the remnants of who he had been buried beneath an overwhelming darkness, and as I stepped closer, licking the edge of sanity, I hesitated, staring into those empty eyes, begging for a sign that this was real, but that sign never came. "Please, Jason, tell me you're okay," I barely managed to whisper, traversing the uneasy terrain between hope and despair, but as he drew nearer, the chilling reality settled like fog. He wasn't okay, he was something else now, a husk twisted and corrupted, a warning that had come alive in the form of a long-lost friend. "You have to play with us again," he beckoned, tightening his grip around my wrist with unnatural strength, dragging me toward the shadows where laughter mingled with cries, each step filled with resistance, my heart screaming for me to turn back, but I couldn't. The roots of memory held me down. Panic clawed at my throat as inky tendrils reached out from the darkness, wrapping around my legs, dragging me forward, and I stumbled, falling onto the damp earth, whispering in frantic disbelief, "Please, tell me I made the right choice coming back." Laughter echoed in response, a symphony of voices entwined with the rustle of leaves, and as I turned to escape, a torrent of figures emerged from the darkness, children, all too familiar yet perverse, their voices melding into one. "You thought we forgot?" they chorused, the same voices from my past, twisted by time, corrupted by whatever dwelled within those woods, and in that moment, I realized the terrible truth. Jason hadn't just vanished into thin air but had become part of something so much larger, something that craved new souls like mine to join the play, to fuel its insatiable hunger. The laughter grew louder, drowning out my thoughts, and I understood with poignant clarity that I had made the wrong choice. There was no escaping this, no undoing of past mistakes, and as hollow laughter filled the air, I screamed into the night, "Can someone please tell me I made the right choice?" Only to be met with silence, ensnared in the web of my own desperation, the shadows closing in as they welcomed me home. I'm a shut-in and took a class to help me learn social skills, but now I wish I'd never signed up. When I first heard about the social skills bootcamp at my local community center, I thought it was my lifeline, a chance to escape the suffocating walls of my apartment that had become my prison. Years of isolation and endless nights spent staring at flickering screens made me desperate to feel something other than the dull thrum of loneliness. So, against my better judgment, I signed up, the glossy flyer promising life-changing experiences that would help me connect with others on a deeper level, making it impossible to resist. On the first day of class, I stood at the entrance, heart hammering, sweating bullets as I hesitantly entered the room packed with strangers who all seemed so at ease, their laughter ringing like chimes while I clutched my notebook like a life buoy. The facilitator was a cheerful woman named Karen, with bright purple hair and a smile wide enough to fit a bus through, even as she guided us through icebreakers that I found torturous, but I smiled along begrudgingly, pretending to be engaging, while I noticed the other attendees seemed more intrigued by each other than the methods we were supposedly learning. But as the weeks rolled on, Karen introduced bizarre exercises, recommend ridiculous role-playing scenarios where we had to feign awkward conversations with one another about mundane topics like the weather or our favorite pizza toppings. I tripped through these exercises, always managing to say the wrong thing or stumble on my words until one day I caught sight of a shadowy figure lurking behind the glass window of the classroom, always gazing in at us, eyes dark like smoldering coals, so unnatural I felt a chill run down my spine. When I finally voiced my concerns during a break, Karen dismissed it with a wave, assuring me that my anxiety was understandable, but telling me to focus on connecting with my peers. Weeks passed, and still, that figure lurked just outside, always obscured by the reflection of the classroom lights, the haunting stare never wavering, spiking my unease even further. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the others, who seemed eager to mingle, minefields of new experiences paved with anxious laughter and shared stories. But I couldn't shake that feeling of being watched, something sinister shared between the figure beyond the glass and the growing camaraderie I let myself believe could be real. Then came the day that shattered everything. Our final exercise was a trust fall activity, where each of us took turns falling backward into the arms of our classmates, and I'd barely stood up for my turn when, as I leaned back, I heard a gasp, then a sickening thud, and when I turned, my heart dropped. There was Karen, splayed awkwardly on the floor, eyes wide and glossy, lips barely parting, but no words came out. A quick glance around the room and I felt something off among my classmates, their faces twisted in a kind of grim fascination that made my skin crawl, and then as if on cue, all faces turned towards the window, only to discover the figure was now inside the room, standing in the very spot I'd stood moments before. That shiver chased the length of my spine as the air thickened, making it hard to breathe, and I felt the rush of adrenaline bonding me into a frozen mass of terror. As the figure, now devoid of its obscurity, stepped forward, its face twisted into an unhinged smile that sliced through my reason, I realized it was someone from the class, someone I'd talked to briefly, who had always stood slightly off to the side, as though waiting for their moment. Black eyes like void stared straight through me as whispered promises of eternal companionship echoed in the recesses of my mind, and in that moment, I wished I had never taken that first step into the classroom. The laughter of my classmates transformed into a cacophony of madness reverberating within the four walls, every youthful face contorted into an unnatural smile that echoed the same promise I had just heard, and I couldn't remember how to function or find the door. I bolted, shoving past the titanic figure with the black eyes fixed on my heart, bursting into the dim hallway outside, but even then, I could hear them chanting my name in harmony, a twisted symphony of delight. The unsettling sensation of being pursued drove me forward, my feet pounding against the cold tile floor, but no matter how I ran, the shadows loomed larger than life, the entire room behind me vibrating with a visceral energy that made me feel sick as if the walls themselves were closing in. When I finally made it outside, owls hooted above in the freshly fallen night, and I took a moment to catch my breath under the flickering streetlights, questioning whether that horrifying ordeal had been real, or if I had just snapped. The thought of returning home made my heart thud in dread, but I had never felt safer in my silence, until I glanced over my shoulder and saw every single one of my classmates, the twisted smiles of familiarity plastered on their faces as they approached from the dark, shuffling with an intention that drained the warmth from my body and replaced it with ice. I stumbled backward, ready to run, but part of me wondered if I'd already dropped the social skills I'd been learning because they had been preparing me for something far more sinister than I could ever imagine. Now, trapped within the embrace of my former classmates, surrounded by those once strangers whose warmth now felt electric and dangerous, I wish I could turn back time, sign up for nothing, and remain the shut-in safely tucked away in my solitary box, forever spared from the horror I never anticipated, a reality where the social skills that I thought would liberate me instead forged a bond with something monstrous lying in wait, something that now called to me in whispers, inviting me to join their harmonious nightmare. And as their eyes locked with mine, all I could think was that no walls could shield me from the haunting knowledge that I had enrolled in the darkest of social experiments. I always knew there was something off about Jimmy, my barber, but I never really questioned it until last Tuesday when the incident happened that changed everything. You see, Jimmy cuts my hair for free, and while I initially thought it was a quirky promotion or maybe a random act of kindness, the truth began unraveling before me in the most sinister way imaginable. I had been a regular at his shop for about 5 years, a small, dimly lit place tucked away in a forgotten corner of town, with rusty neon lights flickering eerily outside. Every time I walked in, that familiar jingle sounded from the old vintage door, and I was greeted by Jimmy's toothy grin, his wispy gray hair matching the worn-out leather barber chair I always sat in. It started innocently enough. I would enter, we'd talk about anything and everything, and then he would cut my hair without ever charging a dime, always waving away my attempts to pay him. One day, I asked him why he doesn't charge, expecting some heartfelt story about community service, but instead, he just chuckled, a low, unsettling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You'll understand soon enough," he replied, his eyes glinting under the dim lights. I shrugged it off as his odd sense of humor, but the air shifted that day, leaving a chill I couldn't quite shake. Over the next few months, people in town started disappearing, first the older folks, then a few teenagers, all of whom had one thing in common: they were his clients. I was certainly no conspiracy theorist. I brushed it off as coincidence or perhaps a string of unfortunate accidents, until I overheard a frantic conversation between two women outside the shop one afternoon. I swear, the last thing I heard from my brother was that he was going to Jimmy's, one of them exclaimed, her voice thick with panic. My heart raced, and just like that, paranoia began seeping into my daily life. I tried to ignore it, but every time I sat in that faded chair, the rumbling of his clippers grew more menacing. The buzzing sound drowned out the little voice inside me that urged me to leave. One fateful day, driven by curiosity and a need for answers, I stayed after my usual cut, pretending to flip through outdated magazines while watching him clean up. That's when I noticed the door to the back room, a place I had never seen him venture to. It remained slightly ajar, revealing darkness beyond, but just enough to catch a glimpse of something shiny. Could it be tools? Or perhaps a stockpile of his hair products? I couldn't quite tell, but my gut twisted with an inexplicable dread. Jimmy walked by, catching me staring, and that grin of his turned into a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Curiosity killed the cat, you know," he said, and I could swear the air thickened around his words. The next week, unable to contain my fear and intrigue, I set out to unravel the truth. I came back after hours, motivated by the impulse that maybe the answer lay hidden in that mysterious back room. My heart pounded as I crept in, the ghosts of missing townsfolk whispering in my ears, propelling me forward. I pushed the door open, and I swear I felt a rush of cold air, the stench of bleach and something else, something distinctly metallic, enveloped me as I stepped inside. The room was lined with mirrors, warped and cracked, reflecting images that seemed to writhe and twist, and right there in the center stood a massive chair, eerily similar to the one I usually sat in. But this one was different. It was stained, slick, and with something dark pooling around its feet, glimmering under the fluorescent lights. My stomach dropped when I noticed the walls were decorated with photographs, snapshots of my fellow townsfolk, smiling or posed, but then there were markings, little notes tracking their last visits, and it hit me like a freight train: these were the people who had disappeared. Suddenly, I felt it, the pervasive gaze of someone behind me. I spun around to find Jimmy standing in the doorway, his presence now ominous, his smile replaced by a featuresless mask of rage. "I told you curiosity kills," he snarled, stepping closer so I could see the remnants of hair clippings covering his hands, the same hands that had so gently cared for my hair. I shuffled back, stumbling upon the chair, and as I did, I could see the tool he held in his grip, a butcher's knife, glinting and dripping, maddeningly clean, just like how he kept everything else. Panic clawed at my throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the walls that seemed to close in, the reflections in the mirror showing countless faceless figures behind me, each one looking at me as though they were silently begging me to escape. My mind raced as I culled through memories of my last haircuts, the way he would talk about taking a little extra off and shaping me up, and it suddenly struck me, he wasn't just cutting hair, he was feeding something, training it, grooming me for whatever dark ritual he performed in this gruesome little room. With every haircut, I was being woven into his tapestry of spirits, my essence twisted into the web of the very thing that kept him young and vibrant, and suddenly everything fell into place. The missing people weren't just clients, they were sacrifices, and the free haircuts were merely a lure to feed his dark appetites. But as he advanced, I felt clarity in my imminent doom. With nowhere to go, I turned to the mirrors, grasping at the reflections that seemed more alive than I ever remembered, and I begged the faces to help me, to pull me away, but they just stared back in their eternal silence. Just when I thought I was trapped, the very mirrors shimmered, trembling as though they were alive, and I felt a surge of hope blossom. Was it possible they could contain him? With a final push of adrenaline, I lunged toward the mirrors, hoping their reflections could shield me, and as I slammed into the glass, I was met with a blinding light. I awoke the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat, and the frantic beat of my heart slowly calmed. I rushed to the barber shop, but the door was locked, and it looked abandoned. The neon lights flickered one last time before fading away, the name Jimmy's Barbershop peeling off the glass like it had never existed. I felt the slither of relief, believing I had woken from that twisted nightmare. But when I caught my reflection in a passing window, that same toothy grin from the back room stared back at me, and a voice whisper echoed in my mind, "I'll always be with you." Now, I keep my hair long, avoiding all mirrors, terrified of the day when Jimmy finds me, because I know now the price for my free haircuts is far too high. He cuts hair for free, but he takes souls instead. I found my classmate's YouTube channel, and she has been missing for years. It was a random Thursday afternoon when I decided to finally tackle the clutter of my laptop files. I hadn't touched them since the start of college, those scattered remnants of high school etched in the recesses of my hard drive. It was in an old folder labeled Friends that I found a collection of photos we'd taken together, and one name stood out, Lana. She'd vanished during junior year, a ghost story whispered between students, our teachers forced to address the loss as though we all should already be coping. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I typed her full name into the YouTube search bar, half-heartedly expecting nothing. Instead, dozens of videos about her popped up, but one thumbnail caught my eye. The video was titled Lost and Found, the date from just 3 days ago, and as I hit play, the screen flickered to life, presenting Lana's familiar face, yet so much older, haunted with shadows that hinted at something deep beneath her eyes. She looked into the camera, and for a moment, I felt like she was staring directly into my soul, all those memories crashing back as she spoke in a shaky voice, recounting a tale about the woods behind our old school, where she had gone to explore the legend of the Whispering Grove, a place rumored to consume people, making them disappear forever. The way she described it sent shivers racing down my spine, her breath hitching here and there as if the memory was too much for her. I barely noticed the sunlight fading outside. I was transfixed as she detailed her experiences, how she had entered the grove with friends but had lost them one by one in the silence that enveloped that cursed patch of trees, all while something began whispering her name. My heart raced, the hairs on my arms stood on end, thinking back to the stories we dismissed as childish. Was there really something out there? But then came the twist. Lana's friends never returned, only she did, appearing as if she'd stumbled out of a nightmare, wide-eyed and breathless, forever changed and then lost to the fog of time, just like so many others, the rumors saying she would be the last. The video continued, showing images of the grove, tall, twisted trees that reached for the sky, as if trying to escape their own roots. I couldn't help but feel an urge to comment, to reach out, but I felt frozen. The video ended abruptly, a still image of her terrified face frozen on screen, the scratches on her cheek looking fresh. Days passed, and my thoughts were consumed by the revelation. What if she hadn't truly escaped? What if every time she spoke about her friends, she was still there, still in that maze of whispers? Eventually, I decided to check the channel again, but there were no new updates. Fearing the worst, I scoured for clues, a trail that would lead me back to her, and in doing so, I uncovered more unsettling videos. They were less coherent, darker, filled with distorted visuals and frantic voices whispering secrets that all felt familiar. Each one starred another faceless person who seemed to be succumbing to the very darkness that claimed Lana. Then I stumbled across a live stream, an experimental series called From the Grove, filled with amateur explorers lured by the legends, unaware of Lana's own tale. On my phone, I typed furiously, warning them in the comments not to pursue it, but the stream rolled on, delighting in the thrill of fear, their voices lost to the clatter of equipment. Just then, as I watched, my heart sank, an image flashed on screen, a familiar face craving recognition in the shadows. It was Lana, tethered and agitated, looking straight into the camera with a desperation that clawed at my sanity. My breath stuck in my throat as she mouthed my name, reaching out yet not reaching at all. I slammed my laptop shut like a trap, my heart racing. I was terrified this was a curse I had unearthed, a demon in the form of nostalgia and despair lurking in the threads of my old memories. What if I was seeing things? What if I was going insane? But a piece of me was drawn back, lured by the same misplaced curiosity. Days morphed into nights, each one revealing new layers of dread as I found myself contemplating her fate. I needed answers. My foolish, reckless adventurism bloomed, and I made the choice. I'd go to the Grove, the place that took her friends, a hell I didn't know, but an obsession ached in my bones. I had to know what I lost. Armed with a flashlight and my phone, I drove to the school, the headlights slicing through the thickening fog like a blade through flesh. The trees loomed larger than I remembered, ancient sentinels silently guarding their secrets. Following an worn path, I felt a pulse of familiarity brush against my skin with every step I took deeper into the grove, the air thickening, whispers grazing my ears with incoherent words. Panic clawed at my throat when the light trembled in response, casting shadows that danced against the twisted bark. There, ahead, I saw it, the clearing, where the very ground pulsated with secrets. My heart thundered as I realized it was the same place I'd seen her in the video just days ago, where it seemed others had tried to cross over into the unknown. Suddenly, the quiet door apart as warped silhouettes emerged, flickering as if caught between worlds, and then I knew, just like the stories foretold, the Grove demanded homage, offering what it had taken. I could sense them, her friends, lost souls intertwined with fate. They whispered for my attention, their words a lullaby of despair. I panicked, dawning awareness clawing at my core as I stumbled back, but the ground quaked beneath me, earth choking with roots grasping my ankles, pulling me deeper into the cradle of shadows. I fought. I screamed. I felt hot tears spill down my cheeks. Was this the end? Just as I was about to succumb, a voice sliced through the cacophony, a voice I recognized. I turned, and there was Lana, standing just out of reach, reaching for me with that same haunted look, eyes wide and pleading. "Don't let it take you," she shouted, her voice piercing the fabric of the night. But the uproar rose up, drowning her out. I could barely breathe, gasping for air as I felt myself slipping, lost beyond the veil. I didn't know if I would escape, if I ever would see the light again, or if I simply stepped into a story that was never meant to be finished. Then the ground gave. I fell into darkness, falling into whispers, and all I could do was fight against the eternal echo of despair, a thousand questions in my mind. The Grove was hungry, and perhaps it craved one more soul to ensnare.